Laura's presentation. I'm not responsible for that. There we go. Thank you all for sitting in. What I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about California. I've been in California energy policy for 37 years. It has been a rough road, to say the least, and it's getting worse. But you know, California always claims to be a leader in environmental policy. And what they're doing right now in terms of climate change is certainly being a leader. But it's a leadership that I refer to as the FLP. And that's the first lemming phenomenon. What I'm going to talk about is part of the raging debate in California has to do with aggregate emissions, total tonnage, or intensity, you know, pounds per GDP, pounds per capita, those sort of things. You've probably heard, and you will continue to hear from some folks in the Senate and some folks in the House, that California's example should be replicated nationwide. If we only did what California did, we wouldn't need any new power plants, we wouldn't need any new anything. Well, what California has achieved is not because of their energy policy. What California has achieved in terms of energy intensity and those things has to do with the fact that, A, we fundamentally restructured our economy in the mid-90s. We don't make anything in California anymore other than movies. We're a service-oriented economy, and service-oriented businesses are inherently less energy intensive. We also have a nice climate. And perhaps all equally important, we have until recently, a red-hot real estate market. So everybody's wondering, you know, what does real estate market got to do with climate change and energy use? Well, you've got 3 and 4 and 5 families living in a single-family residence, doubling up, tripling up, quadrupling up the number of people, so the persons per household is increasing. Well, that drives your energy costs for heating and cooling that home way down. Perhaps most importantly, we constantly get berated that the U.S. is not doing anything except for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're the only industrialized nation that have reduced emissions, and we're on a 10-year track to continually improve our intensity. We always get criticized for 4% of the population, but we use 25% of the natural resources. Well, yeah, we also make 28% of the world's wealth. We're feeding the poor countries and all these other things that are dependent upon our energy infrastructure. Famous bill in California is referred to as AB 32, Assembly Bill 32, and it mandates that California is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions of all sorts, but primarily CO2, to 1990 levels by the year 2020, a further reduction to 80% by 80% in 2050. And it looks like I'm running off the scale just a little bit here, but in early December, the California Air Resources Board established what those targets meant in numbers. 427 million metric tons, 30% reduction. The problem is they have to have known what happened in 1990. Well, in my youth, I happened to have worked at the California Energy Commission. I was a principal policy advisor there. And one of my responsibilities back in 1990 was to do the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And I'm here to tell you, I did not know what I was doing. It's a very complex bill. There's a lot of implementation and whatnot. At last count, there was 36 different committees and working groups and this, that, and the other thing trying to put their arms around how this bill is going to be implemented. Now we have some groups that are concerned about various implementation mechanisms that are generally under the banner of environmental justice. The poor and minority groups don't want to take a disproportionate burden. Well, as it turns out, they're going to take a disproportionate burden no matter how it's implemented. The only way it can be implemented that they will not have a disproportionate burden is this thing we call repeal. All right, if the bill's repealed, then they won't get a disproportionate burden. In addition to all these working groups and committees and advisory councils and whatnot, while the primary responsibility rests with the California Air Resources Board, there's 5 other agencies that are involved. It is spreading like a virus to other states. Many of the program implementations work at cross purposes, and I'll give you an example. I'll talk in a minute about the low carbon fuel standard, which, as it turns out, is going to push people, consumers, towards diesel and away from gasoline, just because of the energy content aspects. Well, diesel is a major contributor to particulate matter in the South Coast Air Quality Management District and in the San Joaquin Valley. So the more diesel you use, because it's lower carbon, the more particulate matter you have. And that's not a good way to do it. Pavley bill. The Pavley bill is basically the increase in vehicular miles per gallon that is the subject of the EPA waiver and the subsequent lawsuits against EPA. You know, Administrator Johnson gets criticized for listening to his boss. He listened to the administration, he listened to the White House, well, he listened to a lot of other people, including Senator Boxer, who's criticizing him for listening to the White House. You know. What's interesting about the Pavley bill is there was no modeling done before the bill was passed. There was no modeling done to say, well, if we do this, here's the impact, here's the benefit. It was not done. There was no ex-ante modeling done. Subsequently, they have done some modeling. And you know how much impact on global emissions of carbon dioxide the Pavley bill will have? Less than 0.5%. Doesn't strike me as compelling, and it's certainly not extraordinary. At the same time, there's going to be a lot of effect on consumers. Price of concrete is going to go up, price of gasoline is going to go up, price of housing stock is going to go up. Maybe not so bad right now. Everything's going to go up, and it's going to hurt consumers, and it's going to disproportionately hurt those consumers who have less discretionary income. A little bit about I'll give you a number here in a little bit in terms of what the total dollar cost of the California economy is going to be, but I'll hold off on it. California currently consumes 44 million gallons of gasoline and about 9 million gallons of diesel every day. What's interesting about this number is we are the 8th lowest per capita consumer of gasoline and diesel in the United States. Everybody thinks California is so car-centric. Well, they are. But we don't use that much gasoline relative to the rest of the nation. In fact, we use quite a bit less. Low carbon fuel standard requires 10% less carbon in the fuel. It was established prior to the Pavley bill and prior to AB 32 that says, and it was by executive order, but it means that at least 5 million gallons of something has to be produced. Well, it's going to be a lot more than 5 million gallons because most everything else has some amount of carbon in it. But 5 million gallons of something else just is not available unless we allow the poor, indigent in Mexico City to continue to starve. The primary beneficiary, until recently, of the low carbon fuel standard was ethanol. And we've seen what ethanol mandates and ethanol tax credits and all that stuff have done to food prices. And oh, by the way, it causes increases in CO2 emissions anyway. What's right about the low carbon fuel standard? It is an intensity-based target as opposed to an aggregate cap. But as I mentioned, it does encourage diesel over gasoline. Excuse me. And there's some other unintended consequences. This is just a graph showing, each state is a bar where California resides in terms of average gasoline usage per capita. And it's really, when I saw this, I was amazed. and I hope you are too. Part of the problem too is that we've got these overlapping duplicative programs. The PEER program is public interest energy research, taxes gasoline and diesel production via electricity. All right. What the PEER program does is it imposes a surcharge on electricity consumption to pay for important programs that the government has deemed. Well, the largest consumer of electricity in California happens to be refineries. So they pay their electric bill, they contribute to this PEER program. We also have heavy subsidies for renewables like wind and solar and whatnot, and a renewable portfolio standard. So the government is paying you to comply with the law. Well, I drive 55 miles an hour on the freeway. I have yet to been stopped and given a check. The RPS also raises rates. The wind energy, for example, is twice as expensive as anything else, except solar. It is twice as expensive, but it has half the value because it's never there when you need it. We have a heat wave every summer, predictable just like clockwork. Every summer in August, we have a heat wave. We have a reduction in reserve margin. Guess where the wind guys are? They're asleep at the switch because there's no wind. Well, how hard is that to figure out? Why is it hot? Because you can't get a breeze. Now there's a new proposal. All right, so all these programs are aimed at reducing climate change and climate change gases and whatnot. Now there's a new proposal for another $60 million. The PEER program, by the way, is $62.5 million a year. Renewable subsidies are $235 million a year. Now there's another proposal for a climate change institute that would focus just on climate change, and that would be tacked onto the ratepayers' bill. That's another $60 million. And you constantly hear from the renewables fuels and the renewable electricity people, well, we just want our fair share. We just want our fair share of subsidies. Putting aside for the time being the rational lack thereof, they do already receive 10 times the subsidy level of anything else when measured on a dollar per useful BTU basis. So, you know, they're at the trough and they're elbowing their partners away. A little bit about energy content. I'm sure you know that ethanol is fine fuel. It burns clean, but it just doesn't get you very far. Now here's another hit for the low income and minority folks is if you have to fill up your tank every 2 weeks instead of every 3 weeks, that's an inconvenience factor, and that has a cost. The inconvenience of filling your tank up with ethanol every 2 weeks instead of with gasoline every 3 weeks equates to almost $1 a gallon, just in the lost time for doing that. I had to put that slide in, see, because my background's chemistry. So the other thing about the low carbon fuel standard is they claim it's a life cycle analysis. All right, so they measure the carbon each and every step along the way. Fundamentally correct approach, but you just can't do it. I happen to raise beef cattle part-time in California, and I know some years are better than other years. And some years my neighbor does great, and other years I do great. And every corn farmer, every soybean farmer has good years and bad years. So you don't have a single input that you can put into little cells, you know, little spreadsheet cells along the way. Every one of them has to be a probability distribution. Did we get rain? How much rain? You know, all these sorts of things. How far is the corn refinery away from us? And unless you do a Monte Carlo simulation of all those probabilities or something similar, your life cycle analysis is like putting your hand on the stove and one in the freezer, and you average it out just about right. It's not right. And we've seen some major new studies in science that says, well, ethanol's not so good. Now we get to the important stuff. What is AB 32 going to do to the California economy? It's going to hit it for $510 billion. This is going to take place over a few decades, but that's like 1 or 2% of our gross state product. People are going to move to Nevada. We're already seeing people move to Nevada and Arizona. Arizona, by the way, has a decreasing energy intensity per capita. Everybody touts California as being great because it's maintained flat per capita. Arizona's getting better. You know, why don't they pick on Arizona for a while? The other thing about the renewable portfolio standards and these fuel standards is it reduces our productivity. And that's the real crux of the problem. It reduces our productivity by requiring the most expensive, least efficient process for producing electricity and whatnot. And what happens to our economic competitiveness when your productivity goes in the wrong direction? Anybody? Hazard a guess? It's going to suck. There's been other factors that have caused California's energy pattern to be what it is. One is the economic structural shift I mentioned. We do have a good climate. The housing trends and demographics, and our energy resource mix. We don't use much coal in California. What we do, we import via wires. It's primarily natural gas, quite a bit of hydro. Interestingly, about 15% of our electricity still comes from nuclear facilities. As our electricity prices go up, people are shifting more and more to natural gas, you know, for irrigation pumps and things that normally would have run on electricity. They're moving to natural gas increasingly. This is just a slide of the success we have as a nation. Our emissions per GDP are going down. That's our energy intensity. We are doing better, and we've been doing better every year for 10 years, or 15 years. And when I talk to politicians, they usually say, well, what's the solution to our problem? I said, well, if you're getting better, there's no problem. You know, there's an old cliche, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Well, it's not broken, folks. That's the end of my slides. And that's the end of my talk, and I assume we're going to take questions at the end.
Yes.
Okay.